Um, Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm William Geiger, former governor of Massachusetts, the chair of the Boston Global Forum. And it's a particular pleasure from Los Angeles, where I teach at UCLA during the winter, to introduce what we hope and expect is going to be a very important series of meetings, events, forums that will be sponsored by the Global Forum in close cooperation with the G7 Summit and with the government of Japan, which is going to be the host country for the G7 Summit this spring. And we hope that we're going to be able to play a constructive role in this, specifically by bringing together policy experts, politicians, scholars, business leaders, leaders in technology, to address some of the pressing global peace, security, and development issues. And one of my great pleasures today, unfortunately I can't stay with you because I've got a graduate class I'm going to teach shortly, is to introduce, and I will do so after a few brief remarks, David Sanger, who's the national security correspondent of the New York Times, and somebody who those of us who are regular readers of the Times know and admire and respect. And when we complete this series of online conferences, each of which will have a guest speaker and then lots of discussion online for about 100 people who have been invited to participate, we're going to send the proposals, send the recommendations that these folks make, the forum makes, to the leaders of the G7 Summit in the hope that we can help them to do their job and do it well and to be as fully informed as possible. So we'll be launching 60 long online dialogues in which we will have international speakers who will address these issues. We will have 12 of these, the first of which is taking place today. And the particular issue that will be the focus of these discussions will be one that the forum has addressed for the past several months. How do we combat cyber terrorism? After the formal sessions that we have, discussants will continue the conversations. They send questions and opinions to each other by email. Members of the Boston Global Forum Special Editorial Board will gather the insights and then send to the speaker. And a final conference in this series of conferences will be held on May 9th at the Harvard University Faculty Club, which will summarize these ideas, report them to national leaders meeting soon thereafter in Japan. So we hope we can play a really constructive role in the lead-in and the lead-up to the G7 Summit in Japan. And we're going to try to raise important questions. What are the challenges and threats of cyber terrorism? What countries, organizations, and groups are the most dangerous and threaten us with cyber terrorism? What are the challenges in the technology, and what roles do government, business, civil society of these G7 nations have, and what role should they play in dealing and solving these challenges and these threats? So we want to be a constructive force. We hope we will be. And we're very pleased today to have as our lead resource person, if you will, David Sanger. Those of you who are regular readers of the New York Times, as I am, will recognize his name immediately. He's, again, the national security correspondent of the Times, has reported at great length on important issues on policy, national security. And David, it's just a real pleasure to have you with us and to welcome you back to another session of the Boston Global Forum. It's been a pleasure to have you, and you're the lead guy on this, so we're expecting great things from you. So, take it away.
Well, thank you, Governor, and appreciate the introduction. It's great to be back at the Boston Global Forum. I envy the fact that you are doing this from sunny California while we are doing this from cold and rainy Cambridge, but that's just part of the deal. You've got a lucky group of...
It's a burden, but somebody's got to do it.
That's right, and you've got a lucky group of students that have you as a teacher out there for the semester. The title of this talk, as I do my work on cyber, and I try to specialize in a lot of cyber issues while covering the gamut of national security issues, is short of war, how to handle state-sponsored cyber attacks. And the phrase short of war is being used for a very deliberate purpose. We're in an era right now when no major power, not China, not Russia, not Iran, even a minor power like North Korea, want to take on the United States or its allies directly. The chances that the G7 would discover that they have been attacked in an old-style kinetic war is probably pretty remote. But cyber does something different. It enables countries to launch an attack that is deniable, easy to hide, might be conducted by some kind of third party who's acting on behalf, whether it's a Russian patriotic hacker or a Chinese member of the PLA who's acting as a freelancer at night, or an Iranian citizen who's operating with the approval of the Iranian government. And the attacks can be dialed up and dialed down, which means that they can stay below the threshold at which the United States or its allies might threaten real retaliation. And that's significant because it means this weapon is much easier to use than, say, a cruise missile, or a drone, or, say, a nuclear weapon. It's inexpensive. You don't need to be on a country's territory to launch it. It's so easy to use, it's almost irresistible. Now, how long have we been aware of this threat? Let me ask you, trying to just move on to the first big slide here. And in 2007, the Bush administration went out and gave its national threat assessment to Congress, something that's done each and every year. And when they did their threat assessment in 2007, it had a very typical line in it, which was, terrorism remains the preeminent threat to the homeland. If you stop most Americans today, they'd probably say the same thing. Cyber attacks in 2007, a mere 9 years ago, did not even make the list. Now, if you flash forward to the next slide and go to the question of what else happened that week, you'll see that that same week the threat assessment came out, Steve Jobs showed up in San Francisco and introduced the iPhone. And a group of intelligence officials and generals showed up at the White House and told President Bush, who was in his last 2 years in office, that they had a way of using a cyber weapon to direct an attack on Iran's nuclear program. So those two things were happening at the same time. We go to the next slide. If this story seems familiar, a new weapon that comes into place but you're not really aware of what causes it, well, just look at this picture, which shows you Orville and Wilbur Wright showing one of their first airplanes to a group of generals on a field in College Park, Maryland, where the University of Maryland is today. And Orville and Wilbur flew this plane around to convince the then War Department that there was a military utility for the airplane. And the generals looked at it and they said, well, we can imagine using this to run out over front lines and see where our enemy troops are, but I can't imagine much other use for it. Well, within 10 years, they were using it as a fighter in World War I. Within 30 years, the atomic bomb was dropped from an airplane. In cyber, we're somewhere in that spectrum. After Orville and Wilbur showed the plane, but long before it was used to drop an atomic bomb. It clearly can be used as a weapon as well as a form of surveillance. But we know as little now about how that weapon will be used as the generals standing out in the field that day looking at this biplane knew about the future of the airplane. Go on to the next slide if we can. Today, we regard cyber in that same threat assessment report as the #1 threat in the United States. Cyber attacks in the U.S. have soared in scale, sophistication, and severity of impact, the last threat assessment said. But General Clapper, who's the head of the Director of National Intelligence, said, well, we might well have to be prepared for a massive attack, say an attack on the power grid or the communications network. It's more likely that there's another scenario, a more subtle use of cyber. If you go to the next slide, think about what that could be. Manipulated or corrupted data. Maybe somebody changes targeting data so that a military unit attacks a hospital instead of a military base. Sends out misinformation. Or gives misbehaving information to physical infrastructure. Rather than make the power grid blow up, supposing you just put set power surges through the system to destroy other equipment around the world. You could send out a false indicator that the water in a reservoir is poisoned, for example, when it's not. Now, as in the case of nuclear, the first big user of cyber as a weapon was us. And you'll see here the front page of the New York Times from 2010 when we first reported, 2012, when we first reported on an operation called Olympic Games, which was the code name for the attacks on Iran. And the attacks were based on attacking those centrifuges that you see in the far right photograph, speeding them up and slowing them down until they blew up. It was a remarkable attack because it was the first time that people had really used computers for a sophisticated military operation that had the effects that you would get only from sending in a saboteur or dropping a bomb. Now, at the time that we wrote about Olympic Games, and can I ask you to go to the next slide? Yeah, that's just fine. We did not have another example of a sophisticated cyber attack directed at the United States or anybody else. In the 3.5 years since we first published that story, we've had a raft of them. The list is too long to sort of reproduce here in the time we have, but what's important to know is that not all cyber attacks are the same. They vary in type and they vary in motive. So if you go on to the next slide, you'll see some are for espionage. There you go. Some are for the manipulation of data, as we described. And some are for destructive purposes, like Olympic Games. Go on to the next slide, if you could, Tuan. And you'll see that the kind of attacks have actually not only evolved, but grown significantly in their sophistication. The most common are for espionage and intellectual property theft. That's something the Chinese do a lot of. Far less common are those with clear military effects, like Stuxnet. Although the US and China and Russia are all investing billions of dollars in supplementing their traditional military capabilities with cyber capabilities. And you're beginning to see the rise of attacks that are politically motivated, tied to an event, a confrontation. The attacker might not, in this case, want to remain anonymous. So let's go take a look at what kind of attacks fit into these three different categories. So the attacks aimed at infrastructure include Stuxnet. That was the attack on the Iranian facilities. That was a set of codes used in Olympic Games. There was the German steel mill last year, which was destroyed or largely shut down by a cyber attack of unknown origin. Just this past Christmas time, there was an attack on the Ukrainian power grid that may have been mostly for political purposes, if you believe that Russians conducted it to show the Ukrainians that at any time they could turn off their power. And in fact, if you go to this next slide, you see that political messaging can be a very big element of this. The attack on Sony Pictures Entertainment last year was a good example of that. An attack that destroyed 30,000 computers, but about 70% of Sony's computing power at Sony Pictures Entertainment. Saudi Aramco suffered a loss of 30,000 computers when attacked by Iran a few years ago. The Sands Casino, owned by Sheldon Adelson, was attacked after Mr. Adelson had suggested that the U.S. could just drop a nuclear weapon in the Iranian desert. Now, there are other attacks that are aimed largely at espionage, and that includes the attacks on the State Department and the White House by Russia, the Unit 61398 attacks, that's a People's Liberation Army attack, which stole intellectual property and data from the United States, and the Chinese attack on the Office of Personnel Management. We'll come back to some of those. Now, many questions remain unanswered right now about what these attacks would prompt in the way of an American or other response. So first you've got to solve the problem of attribution, figuring out where an attack came from. That's often not easy because it's fairly simple to hide where an attack originates. But if you do have the attribution solved, you then have to ask the question, what are the factors that make you decide whether to reveal publicly who the attacker was? What would you do to respond? Would you use diplomacy? Would you use sanctions? Would you use cyber or kinetic responses? When's a cyber attack not a cyber attack? And we'll come back to that in just a moment. There have been some attacks that the Director of National Intelligence has suggested really are more like espionage and less like an attack. And what about when the United States might use its own offensive weapon? Now we'll start with the Sony attack because it's sort of the best known. This is a poster you can see from the movie itself, a pretty terrible movie called The Interview. But what was fascinating about it was that the North Koreans decided to attack Sony in an effort to stop the movie from showing up. The movie, of course, was based on a fictional, crazy idea that two nutty sort of comedians who were sent out to interview Kim Jong-un actually try to assassinate him. But the Sony incident encapsulated a lot of the themes and some of the surprises of cyber conflict. Sony is a movie studio. It's not critical infrastructure. It's not an electric power grid. It's not a water supply. The objective here was not really theft, although they did steal some emails. It was really a political one, to try to suppress the distribution of a movie, a suppression of free speech. The code was incredibly destructive. As I said before, it wiped out 70% of Sony's computing power. And the hackers, or someone working for them, had enough cultural awareness to realize that if you released emails about stars and starlets and how much money studio executives made, well, that would probably be embarrassing to somebody. The government, the US government, decided fairly quickly to come out and name North Korea as the culprit. But that was a very big decision internally, because the government was not willing to go reveal its sources on this. Ultimately, the New York Times did that for it. And you'll see here a story that we published when President Obama vowed a response to the cyber attack on Sony. And you should be up to that page at this point. That resulted in a big Situation Room debate that dealt with the question of whether or not by publicly announcing that North Korea was behind the attack, you could make the point to deter them in the future by showing them that you knew where they lived. Now, if you go on to the next slide, you'll see that the intelligence community was very reluctant to name the North because it would reveal some code name projects that they had to get up inside North Korea's computer systems. And we've got here a little flash of a cable that was within the NSA revealed by Mr. Snowden that described this operation to get into Sony. If you go to this front page, which comes from January of last year, you'll discover that the Times revealed that we managed to track the cyber attack to the North Koreans because it was evident that the NSA was inside their systems and they could find some similar coding that convinced the president that in fact it was North Korea. Now, what did we learn from the Sony attack? Well, one thing that we learned is that Director Clapper, the head of the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence, wasn't aware of the attack when it was underway, even though the attackers spent many months inside the Sony system trying to prepare for the day when they would actually bring down the computers. We also learned that Sony itself never really saw the attackers coming. That's a very typical thing. And if you go on to the next slide, you'll see that a lot of people making the point that until Sony, a lot of people in the government with lots of PowerPoints were explaining cyber weapons without really understanding them. So a big question that we need to ask is, did President Obama create any new kind of deterrence by naming North Korea? Was that deterrence sufficient? Was there a lesson learned about how you shouldn't release the name of a country that you believe is guilty of a cyber attack unless you're also willing to release the evidence? Because many people denied it was North Korea right after the president made that charge. Now, let's turn to one other big cyber attack, because it's very different. It was not an attack designed to destroy equipment. It was not designed to reveal emails. Instead, it was the attack on the Office of Personnel Management, a bureaucracy in Washington that just keeps the files on all federal employees, particularly those with security clearances. They were hacked for more than a year by an attacker that we now believe to be Chinese. The files, 22 million of them, were all exfiltrated, sent out of the country. And those files included people's fingerprints, their financial histories, their medical histories, the names of their kids, the name of their spouses, all kinds of things that could be used to identify an individual. Now, was this a cyber attack? If you listen to General Clapper, the answer is no. It was merely espionage on a grand scale. If we had the opportunity, he said at one point, we would have done the same thing, and I'm sure he's right about that. But on the other hand, the scale of the theft was so huge. 7% of the U.S. population's records were stolen, that you have to begin to ask, is that ordinary espionage, or is that something deeper? The traditional view is that this was just classic espionage. They were collecting as much data as they could. The more modern view is that the Chinese were actually getting all the data they needed to be able to authenticate that they were somebody who they weren't, by grabbing fingerprints, by grabbing all of that personal data. Now, the U.S. did not name China, but they did tell the Chinese this had to change. And if you go on to a slide about the debate over retaliation, what you'll see is that there was consideration in Washington of going after the Chinese and show them that we couldn't do to them what they can do to us. In the end, that was rejected for fear that it would cause an escalation of events. So instead, the White House went ahead and negotiated out some norms of behavior with President Xi of China when he was in Washington last fall, agreeing that they would not, for example, steal to gain commercial advantage, steal intellectual property, and so forth. But that did nothing to stop the kind of spying that took place at OPM. So I think one of the big questions to ask here in conclusion is, in the last year, have we made progress on deterring attacks? The White House claims we have, that by indicting Chinese PLA hackers, by naming the North Koreans, taking other steps, they've raised the cost of conducting a cyber attack against the United States. Others disagree and say, North Korea didn't pay much of a price, nor have the Chinese, and the agreements that they reached for norms of behavior may well be violated. That gets to the sort of central core problem that the United States has. And a final thought here, there also is a problem about when the United States uses a cyber weapon itself. The U.S. wants to maintain a presence in cyber networks around the world, but the minute you turn one of those to using it as a weapon, you reveal where you've been. And that creates a big tension within the U.S. government between those who collect information and those who are operators who want to be out there. On the other hand, if you don't set up some of these norms, if you don't show that you're willing to retaliate, you're probably going to be subject to cyber attacks from a lot of countries around the world for a long time. And that doesn't even add in the terrorists and others like that. So I'll leave it there and be eager to take your questions. I thank you very much for having me, and look forward to our discussion.
we have there a lot of questions sent to you today. And the first, you can see the question from Vietnam Net by Anh Thi Lan Nguyen, journalist from Vietnam. Yes, you can.
Well, the first question is, network security is a major topic at these conferences. What would the role of the G7 countries be on this issue? And the answer to that is, it's the G7 countries that are going to have to expand on these norms of behavior that were set with the Chinese. Begin to come up with a set of behavior that we consider to be acceptable and not acceptable, just the way we had to come up with rules about how we would use chemical weapons, biological weapons, drones, even nuclear weapons. It's much harder to do in the case of cyber because it's not just governments that control cyber weapons. Teenagers may, criminal groups may, and they all don't sign treaties.
The second question from Robert Whitcomb. Yes.
That question is, which nation is the worst cyber threat? Well, if you ask the Iranians, the answer is, we are, the United States. If you ask the United States, they'd probably say Russia is the most sophisticated, China is probably the most tenacious, doing the most theft. Iran is probably the one that worries them the most for its up-and-coming nature, and the North Koreans are the most unpredictable.
The third question that is from also come back with Anh Thi Lan Nguyen, Vietnam Net.
And that question is, the internet's become a powerful tool for the Islamic State. Its network is very sophisticated and unpredictable. Is there a need for an international strategy for dealing with this threat? Absolutely. And that strategy has got 2 or 3 different components to it. One of them is going after the individual content so that use of these communications for recruitment is limited. Now, that's a very difficult thing to do, especially in the United States, because it raises all kinds of First Amendment issues. The second thing is you can try to cut some of the actual communications lines.
Yes.
But intel agencies don't want to do that because they want to be able to track the Islamic State.
Yeah.
And the third thing that you can do along these lines is you can use cyber to go back and actually try to attack individual cells of the Islamic State.
Yes. Next question from Robert Welcome.
He asked, what can the UN do about the cybersecurity problem? Not terribly much. They can endorse norms, but the bigger question here isn't to look to super governmental organizations, it's to look to private industry, which has got most of the targets. I mean, think if somebody's going to attack the cell phone network or the electric power network, those are owned privately in the United States and in many other countries. So this is a case where the UN's blessing may be useful, but private industry's action is essential.
Yes. And next question that is from Vietnam Net, Russia and China.
Russia and China have made cyber attacks on the U.S. government and private security systems. What's the appropriate response? Very good question. So far the U.S. has done sanctions. So far the United States has negotiated out with the Chinese, but it has not launched counter cyber attacks. And that's good because you can't control the escalation when it happens, but it may also make the price of conducting a cyber attack seem pretty low. So it's worrisome.
And next question, what can government and based in this do immediately to better protect themselves?
Well, the answer to that is it's fairly easy to protect yourself from ordinary cyber attacks. You know, you change passwords. Eventually we'll get to a system that no longer uses passwords. You make sure that you understand who's on your network. You make sure if people come in and use their own cell phones and so forth that you know just what's happening to the data. These are all just sort of best practices. It's what people in the industry of cybersecurity call the safe sex issues of cybersecurity. It's making sure that everybody is being extremely careful. But I'd be fooling you if I said that those same techniques would help you against a state sponsor, who are usually pretty sophisticated.
And next question from Llewellyn King.
Llewellyn King's question is, are we keeping ahead of potential hackers, or is their sophistication growing in tandem with our defenses? Very good question, and the answer is that this is a horse race in which different horses nose their way out ahead at various points in the race. Sometimes the attackers are ahead, sometimes the defenders are ahead. But more often than not, the attackers outpace the defenders.
Yes. Next question from Bob Welcome.
Okay.
Yeah. How much cooperation?
How much cooperation can the United States government get from Google, Facebook, and others in fighting online crime? Well, all of those companies participated in a meeting with the White House a few weeks ago in which they pledged to go help, at least on ISIS and so forth. On online crime, they can be a lot more useful because it affects them as well. But there are privacy issues that keep all of those companies at various points from, say, turning over to the government indicators of exactly where an attacker might be living.
Yes. Next question from Bill Ottman, from CEO of Mice.com.
He asked what the NSA Director Michael Rogers' recent statements on the strange nature of encryption backdoors, saying the premise of backdoors is a waste of time, that they're ineffective in an invasion of privacy. Well, what he's saying here is the United States government may have moments where they do need to get in through a backdoor, but if you create a backdoor, you run the risk that you're creating an opening that the Chinese or the Russians or the Iranians or the North Koreans or some criminal will also find, and that's very risky.
And next question from Llewellyn King.
So Mr. King asks, it's widely believed that electric power installations and generating stations are vulnerable if they went offline. It would cause huge economic losses. Is that so? Yes, it would, but because the vulnerability has been noticed for so long now, I would say that that sector is among the better in getting its act together in protection.
And next question that I answer Llewellyn King.
He says, we used cyber interference in Iran. What did we learn? We didn't use cyber interference, Llewellyn. We used cyber attack. We actually got into their systems and made their systems blow up. What did we learn? That it's easier to make something blow up than it is to start it up again. And that if you think your code is going to stay secret, it probably won't. That's how that whole program got exposed.
And thank you for Bill Guest. He have just sent a question here. Bill Guest, he is a member of discussion group of Boston Global Forum G7 Summit Initiative, and he is a senior editor of Free Beacon. Free Beacon, Washington Free Beacon. Yeah. So the two questions. So
let me borrow your phone here and,
yes,
and read these. These are from Bill Gertz, an excellent reporter. Bill asked, you highlighted the debate over how to respond. I reported last year the intel community conducted a national intelligence estimate that said unless greater pushback was made, cyber attacks would continue and get worse. Should the USG develop deterrence? The answer is yes, of course they could, and they should, and they are trying, Bill. But the fact of the matter is developing deterrence in the cyber world is a lot harder than it is in the nuclear world. If you think about it, in the nuclear world, you could go into a big cave in Colorado and see a map up on the wall, and you could see if missiles were being launched against you from the Soviet Union. You can go in and see a similar wall for cyber activity in Virginia at a hidden facility for the Department of Homeland Security. But you may not really know where those attacks are coming from. And until you know where they're coming from, they're very difficult to deter. So then the question is, can you have a ladder of escalation on deterrence where first you warn a country, then you do economic sanctions, then you might do a counter cyber attack, and if their attack on you was big enough, if it say it did shut down the utility system, you might turn around and do a kinetic attack on them. Now Bill asks a second question. Private industry is also being hit hard by foreign cyber theft and attacks. Please address what to do about the private sector dealing with cyber attacks. And the answer to that is that private industry can protect itself, but it usually cannot fight back. There are laws against what's called hacking back. So they have to have resilience and they have to have protection, and not in that order. That means they have to try to see an attack before it starts, but if it does start, you have to have enough depth that you can recover from it.
Bill Ottman have just sent some question more that many governments.
Okay.
Yes.
Many government data centers and worker terminals are not properly secured. They lack tools like HTTPS, database encryption, or two-factor authentication, which is where we use your fingerprint or some question about your past to authorize. How can we create a unified set of security standards to be implemented across networks of the world? Well, part of the problem of having a unified set is that a unified set is very predictable, and somebody would only have to defeat one type and set of questions. So the internet was never built with security in mind. We're adding it on in layers here. But the most secure stuff gives you multi-factor authentication. Your fingerprint, your DNA, maybe your retinal read, something that makes it very clear to the system that it's you.
And also come back with Nguyễn Thị Lan Anh for Vietnam Led. She asked you, you think optimistic about cyber terrorism in 2016, or you think pessimistic in this year?
Well, the question is, how optimistic am I about stopping cyber terrorism? A lot of what we've been discussing here today is not cyber terrorism. It's cyber theft.
Yes.
It's cyber attack. Terrorism would be if you held something hostage. So we said, if you don't pay me a big ransom, I won't turn your power back on. I'm not as worried about that in 2016. There's some risk of it, of course. But I am more worried about the manipulation of data and about old-fashioned cyber attacks. And that's why you're seeing more and more companies buy cyber insurance so that they can actually go invest in the tools they need to prevent cyber attacks.
So you read about article of Joseph Nye yesterday. Yeah. So what do you think about?
So yesterday we wrote about a report that came out from the Berkman Center for the Internet and Society here that dealt with the question of encryption. And it asked the question, is the FBI, are the intel agencies right in demanding that they have access to all encrypted communications? Tuan here has got his iPhone out, and I've got my iPhone here someplace. And if I sent an email now, or a text message, even better, to Tuan, my phone would be encrypting it, and his phone would be de-encrypting it,
Yes.
and neither of us would know what that code was. Now, let's say somebody wanted to get that information from Apple. And they went to Apple and they gave them a subpoena. And they said in that subpoena, turn over all of the communications between David and Tuan.
Yes.
Apple would only be able to turn over to them complete garbage. They'd only be able to turn over to them something that would essentially be unreadable. And in order to decrypt it, you'd have to have the code in my phone or the code in your phone. A lot of intelligence agencies are very worried about that. They say, we can tap a telephone, we want to be able to get into these messages. And the answer to that is, you know, there's a lot more in this phone than just my communications. There's my medical history. There's my financial history. There are my bank accounts. There are pictures of my kids. I don't want the government inside that. And because of that, you're seeing stronger and stronger encryption being designed. Now, the internet report that you referred to the other day said, is encryption a problem? Sure. But there are so many other ways for the government to track us these days. If you're wearing a Fitbit, it knows where you're walking. If you're in a car that's got GPS communications, we can follow the car.
Yes.
The list goes on. And so their report was saying, you know, the protection you get from encryption may be more valuable than the individual risk you get from not being able to break it.
Yes. And Dick Pizzolo asked question about can China be deterred in cyberspace? That article from Social Line yesterday. You can.
That's right.
Yes.
And so Joe argued in this article, if I read it right, that the question is, what can you do to deter the Chinese? And the answer is that they are invested in the system as well. Because over time, while they're stealing more material from us, they will begin to invent their own stuff, and they're going to need to be able to protect it.
Yes.
And so you can begin to set up a set of norms that will be in their interest as well.
Yes. And also, one people from Passport, he sent me that question immediately. That is, we are about have a safe. What do you think about have a safe seal that they have just discussed? Yeah.
Have a safer.
Safer, have a.
Let me take a look.
Yes, you can see.
Oh, farewell. Oh, for safe harbor.
Yes.
Okay. So this has to do with a dispute between Europe and the United States about who's protecting your data. If Google moves, say, all of Tuan's data from Vietnam or from someplace in France over to the United States.
Yes.
And so there had to be a series of agreements by the United States about what they would and would not look at within that data. And there's a lot of reason to question whether or not, if they were under great stress, terrorism case or something like that, the U.S. government would obey by those agreements, or whether they would actually just go in and grab whatever data they could.
Yes. And that Boston Global Forum collaborate with Japan government to that host G7 country to develop initiative for to combating cyber terrorism. So what is your advice and something consult advice for this initiative? You think?
Well, my first piece of advice is don't limit yourself by calling it cyber terrorism.
Yes.
Because there are such a range of cyber attacks, cyber espionage, cyber exploits, and cyber terrorism, that if you limit yourself to terrorism, you're only attacking a small part of the problem.
Yes.
The second is think big. The internet, as I said before, was never designed for security.
Yes.
We may at some point have to redesign the internet from the bottom up
Yes.
in order to build true security into it.
Yeah. That redesign internet, yeah, and redesign the protocol for communication.
From the very start.
Yeah. Okay. So that means start again and think out box.
That's right. Well, it's not only a clean out box, but it's starting thinking about structuring the internet entirely differently.
Yes.
Look, it's expensive to do,
Yes.
but it was expensive to build U.S. highways. You know,
Yes.
when we first decided that the road network could no
Yeah.
longer carry the kind of traffic we had.
So if you join with this initiative, you think you can have some ideas to new design?
Well, let's hope so.
Yes.
It's going to take a lot of smart people a long time. People who are a lot more technically adept at this than I am.
Yes. And this year also New York Times focus on this issue, that is the cyber attack or cyber.
The Times devotes a lot of space to cyber issues. We cover it from Washington, we cover it from China, we cover it from Silicon Valley.
Yes.
It's a big story because it touches on everybody's lives.
Yeah, thank you so much for your.
Thank you, Tom. Great to be with you,
Yeah.
and good luck with your series.
Yeah, thank you so much for your comment and contribution. For very exciting and very important first speaker and first series online dialogue. Thank you so much for joining us and also send question, and see you on February 11 at 11 a.m. Boston time. Yes. February 11 and at 11 a.m. Thank you so much. With at that time we will talk with Bruce Senior. Yes. Thank you. Thank you.
Great.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Glad we made it all work.
Yes.
This was much easier than trying to do it from Washington yesterday.
Yeah, yeah,
Great.
much better. We have a team here and everything.
Yes.
Logistic here better.
Can make it all work.
But if you don't have you don't have Thai camp here, so we can do in Washington.